Welcome, everyone, to episode 5 of The Argument Clinic. This episode will talk about cross-examination, one of our, honestly, the most fun topics that we get to talk about. I personally find it extremely enjoyable. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, I'm Martin, your host. I'm with Lawrence Zhao over here, and this is a podcast for everyone. We've designed this podcast to be relevant to the entire span of debate tournament experiences. It's relevant to new debaters, it's relevant to old debaters, it's relevant to coaches, or it's just relevant to anyone who just loves to have a good time and learn about the fantastic world of Lincoln Douglas debate. No special guest for this week. We'll be talking about cross-examination, and we'll have plenty of other opportunities to have other episodes on cross-examination, so I'm not too worried that we don't have a guest for this week. Before we get into the substance of our topic, though, let's talk about where we were in the past week. So, Lawrence, I was at the varsity state championship in Orlando, Florida, which was a pretty good time. Got to execute a lot of the things that we talked about in the topic analysis episode last week, and did pretty well besides. Where were you in the last few weeks?
I was at the West Oklahoma District Tournament here, actually on the campus of the college I go to, coaching a few kids and judging a few debates over the housing topic, using some of the arguments that we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago in the topic analysis.
One of my kids in the state championship got to the quarterfinals, aka he got fifth because of his speaker points. How did your kids do?
Two of them did not qualify, but one of them did qualify to nationals at Norman, and another student of mine qualified to nationals at a district tournament in Texas, which was exciting.
That is exciting. Awesome. So, before we get into the substance of our talk, one quick word about our sponsor, Victory Briefs. Victory Briefs is the whole package. It's really an excellent debate camp, an excellent website, and a very well-run just enterprise that involves current college students, that involves high school students. It's really, Victory Briefs is committed to debate camp for everyone, regardless of their level of experience, and I've just had a great time working with everyone at Victory Briefs and sort of the surrounding groups. And I understand that you like Victory Briefs very much as well.
Yeah, I'm a curriculum director at Victory Briefs, and we're actually planning out enrolling a few exciting announcements within the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned. They'll be announced most likely on the Victory Briefs site at vbriefly.com, so we're excited for that.
Will the announcements be on a boulder?
They will not be, unfortunately. They'll be...
Then how do you expect on rolling them out?
Well, maybe we'll put an animation of them rolling out on the website. I probably won't do that, actually.
As an important, informed consumer of your content, I demand that in order for you to roll something out, you have to actually roll it out. Otherwise, how will we know that you guys are even serious?
Because we won't roll things out on boulders.
Come on. Okay, so some more quick housekeeping before we get into the substance of our stuff. So please leave us an iTunes review if you enjoy the podcast. That will increase the likelihood that when people look us up, looking for debate podcasts or stuff like that, that they are actually find us because we're sort of a well-reviewed website. If you have any emails, send them to theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. We've gotten a couple of emails since then. If you recall, last week on the podcast, I specifically instructed any Lawrences that were offended at Lawrence Zhao saying that he was the only important Lawrence, and we got an email from theimportantlawrence@gmail.com, nice domain, saying that they were extremely offended by this. So special shout out to theimportantlawrence at gmail.com. We also had another email from someone just like asking us about some of the various statistics and stuff that we talked about in the last podcast. So, and we were happy to provide some of that information as well. So if you have any email whatsoever, whether it was kind of the fun email like we got it from the important Lawrence, or it's just it's strictly information based. If you're just wondering something about something that we said during the podcast, wondering about some of the information that we were using, wondering about some of the strategies, maybe want some further explanation of stuff, feel free to shoot us an email and we'll be happy to respond. Also, feel free to like our Facebook page, our Twitter account. We have a Reddit account, although the Reddit account obviously only just posts Argument Clinic stuff. But I think that's it. Oh, one other thing. Special shout out to our 4 Canadian listens. We're able to track via SoundCloud the people that listen to us at various locations, and we have 4 listens in Canada. So if you're in the Great White North or whatever I believe it called, power to you. That's good. I don't know exactly why you'd be listening there. I don't know if there's... Lawrence, do you think there's Lincoln Douglas debate in Canada?
I have no clue. We could Google this, but that would be a lot of effort on our part.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to Google it, but if you're one of our Canadian listeners, please send us an email or a message confirming that you, in fact, do Lincoln Douglas debate, whether or not there's Lincoln Douglas debate in Canada, or whether you just like the sounds of our voice for various other reasons. Okay, now sort of the substance of our topic. So this is a choreography episode. It's on cross-examination, which is one of the most exciting aspects of debate. Not to be confused with the Crossfire, which is a public forum abomination that involves people sort of shouting at each other for 3 minutes, where people try to ask each other questions. It's also not to be confused with the Grand Crossfire, which is the same thing, except it's 4 people talking at each other at the same time. So there's a sort of additional layer of shouting that goes on. Lawrence, what is your experience with the Grand Crossfire?
I judged a few public forum debates this weekend at districts. I also did public forum a little bit in high school.
Wow, and that was not something that you should have admitted to me.
I'm sorry, I wasn't one of the old people at my school my freshman year, so I didn't get a slot to the district tournament in LD, so I had to go in public forum, which is what I had to take to nationals my freshman year.
But I'm definitely just going to make fun of you forever now.
I mean, it's okay, because I also don't like public forum that much. But yeah, I've witnessed 1 or 2 shouting matches during Grand Crossfire. I would not recommend it as an intellectual activity.
I've seen some good Grand Crossfires in my day. I will say that the majority of them are along the same lines. But anyway, this isn't a podcast for us to just make fun of public forum debate. There is not much cause for that. And if you're a public forum debater and you're offended by this, please send us an email at theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, and we will be happy to give you the what for. So without further ado, let's go to the basics of cross-ex. All right, Lawrence, so let's get started on the basics of cross-examination. First thing, before we get into kind of like mechanics and how to ask questions, which are, spoiler alert, our next 2 sections, #segue. But before we do that, let's talk about the importance of cross-examination. Lawrence, why is cross-examination important?
So I think it's really important because it's the only time during the debate where the judge gets to really witness you directly compared to your opponent. And because it's possible for debaters to just basically read off of paper the entire time that they're debating, and they don't really get to demonstrate much knowledge or control of the topic, or their arguments, but in
Please don't
cross-examination,
do
you're
that, by the
forced
way.
to. Oh yeah, don't just read the entire debate. That's bad.
Yeah, bad.
But cross-examination is where you have to get off the script and you have to think for yourself and you have to think on your feet and you have to really show directly to the judge that you are capable of holding your own against an opponent directly compared to your opponent. Unlike speeches, which, the judges have like lots of time in between to see both of you, and it's hard to make a comparison. And this is where you get to really show you're in charge.
That's definitely true. And to build off of that specific point, I think one of my strengths as a debater was that I was a very good listener. Like, I just have really good short-term listening memory. And when people asked me a question, I could understand exactly what they were saying and sort of respond accordingly. So I always looked good in cross-examination, even from an early stage, because someone would ask me a question and I would know immediately what they were answering. And one of the things is that if you can demonstrate to the judge that you are on the same page as the judge, but your opponent is not on the same page as both of you, that can be really helpful perceptually. So to key off of what you were saying, Lawrence, one of the key ideas about cross-ex is that it's important for you perceptually. Is that it? Is it that it makes you just look better to the judge?
Yeah, and you get to connect with your judges you're talking about earlier, like have the moment of like only we know what's going on. Our opponent, like the opponent just has no clue what's going on in this debate. We're the ones that are jiving right here.
Do you speak jive?
I speak the language of the jive, yes.
That's good. That's good. Have you seen Airplane, Lawrence?
No.
So that joke was just completely lost on you.
Oh, wait, you
Just a
you make
total
jokes?
waste.
Oh, you make jokes. Sorry, I don't take
Ooh,
anything you say.
that is cold. We instruct our listeners to stay frosty every week, but this is the frostiest man right here to just deliver just a sick, just freezer burn right there, uh, administered directly to my self-esteem. Um, yeah, you should totally see Airplane though. You're a degenerate. Anyway, so um, one thing about cross-ex is that it's particularly important for kind of what you would consider a lay judge, someone who maybe is not as experienced in keeping track of the flow of the debate. Maybe they don't write down things that everyone says. Maybe they don't take very good notes. But cross-ex is kind of just like a sort of high intensity debater on debater combat that they can really jive with. And in a lot of those rounds, cross examination like decides the debate. Like I purposefully, personally have tons of examples of when I basically won a round or lost a debate solely on the basis of cross-ex. Can you think of any times, Lawrence, where like cross-ex basically just sealed the deal for you?
Yeah, my senior year at nationals, one of the outrounds that I had, the comment from one of the judges was, "Well, this debate was basically over after their cross-ex. I was negative in this debate and cross-examining the affirmative in, I don't know, like round 9, 10 of nationals or something like that." And he just had no defense of his ethical system in the value criterion debate, and it demonstrated. And so the judges were like, "Yep, clearly, I think the negative knows what's going on more than the affirmative does." And that sort of set the stage for the rest of the debate, because even though the affirmative gave, I thought, pretty decent 1 ARs and 2 ARs, he had already perceptually been behind, given a cross-examination that demonstrated he was not as knowledgeable about these arguments as he should have been.
So you basically gutted him like a fish.
It was, I thought, a pretty good debate on my part.
Okay, so everyone write that down. Lawrence gutted one of his opponents like a fish because of cross-ex. Don't be gutted like a fish. We'll give you plenty of opportunities to keep your guts intact on this podcast. So, one other important thing about cross-ex is that it is really one of the only opportunities in sort of a time effective way to kind of just like expose your opponent, you know? Like your opponent has been exposed. The general idea is if your opponent's argument like maybe it's fine, its warrant maybe isn't quite the best, but it'll do. But in cross-ex, you can make it look like a lot worse than what it is. Um, or if your opponent kind of has like a flawed study, but it might take way too long in a speech to explain why the study is flawed. Like, what about that thing makes it a flawed study? Or it would just take way too long. One really cool thing you can do in cross-ex is make an argument, basically, in cross-ex, or sort of ask questions on that will make it take a lot less time for you to have to devote in your speech to that argument. Do you kind of see where I'm going here, Lawrence? It's like you have an argument maybe about a study or something, and your opponent, and like it would take you too long to explain it, really, fully. But if you get some of it out of the way in cross-ex, then the judge kind of already understands what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think on the living wage topic as well as the handguns topic, there was a lot of studies that were very common, and so debaters developed very specific answers and indites to the specific studies that were being read on both sides. And cross-examination was a good place to start forwarding these objections to these studies and explaining why they were flawed studies. And we did this, not only across the circuit, you could see debates like this happening, but even in sort of more traditional rounds in Oklahoma, debaters were reading carded indites. But because they were so long, the best thing to do was to introducing cross-examination first and demonstrate that you knew the evidence that is being read in this debate better than your opponent did.
Yeah. And that's one important thing to emphasize before we go on. Strong responses to cross-ex questions, and by strong, I mean like, I don't know, like capable of lifting large amounts of weights and stuff. A strong response to a cross-ex question can be just as good as asking a devastating cross-ex question. So it is important. Like, it is a time where your metal, like copper, is tested. Where your metal is tested, where they check and make sure your copper isn't bendable. You know, you know, you know what I'm saying, Lawrence?
I suppose I'll just say yes.
Okay, good. Um, all right, so let's talk about some just basic mechanics of cross-ex. This is some fairly easy stuff, but it's stuff that not everyone does, and sometimes people like aren't told that they have to do this and are kind of losing perceptual points, kind of just like right off the bat. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on these, but it is important to get the basic mechanics of cross-ex. First things first, you ask the judge if people are ready to start cross-ex, and then the judge and your opponent, and you start. But the key thing is, Lawrence, when you are having when you're having kind of like an argument or a questioning session with someone in real life, like outside of debate, because debate is very not real life, outside of debate, sort of where would you be looking when you're having a discussion with someone?
I typically look at the nearest window or plant.
Okay. That is a good answer. I will award you a 2 out of 10 for life skills. Um, so generally you would look at the other person.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I meant to say.
yeah. Unless you're Lawrence. However, in debate, well, so the reason why you're doing that when you talk to a person, which is kind of not exactly explained. First of all, it would be kind of weird if you didn't look at them. Um, and
I don't think so.
Lawrence just loves locking eyes with petunias. Um, so the thing is, though, you're trying to convince them of something. You're trying to convince the person you're talking to of something, whether that thing is that, I don't know, they're a stupid dum-dum head or something else, um, or of like a particular point, you're talking to them. Now, in a debate round, are you trying to convince your opponent that they're wrong?
I've never once successfully convinced an opponent that they were wrong.
Well, I probably did, but like only in like novice year and whatever. I mean, like out like in novice year, you could pretty much just like like if you were persuasive enough, just cause your opponent to switch sides in the middle of a debate.
Yeah. But
But
even then, I mean, like, you get them to switch sides and, like, change their beliefs, and yet you somehow still haven't won the debate.
yeah, that's true. Although usually you do. So the thing that we're getting at here is that you want to face the judge, not the opponent, when you're on cross-examination. Most of you already know this. And the rationale is that you don't want to stare your opponent in the eyes because you're not going to convince them of anything. You want to stare the judge in the eyes so that you can convince the judge that what your opponent is saying is foo-foo nonsense. Trademark. Foo-foo nonsense is a thing that we should just start saying on the podcast more frequently, Lawrence. And I'll take your silence as agreement. Speaking of silence, silence in cross-examination is bad to an extent. It's pretty bad when you're asking questions, and it can be even worse when you're answering questions. Generally, you want to be talking most of the time. One thing, though, is um, it's okay. It's completely okay to take some time to think about your opponent's question. It's completely fine if your opponent, like, as long as it's not too long, but you have about a couple of seconds where you can really think up an answer to a question. It's way better to do that than to just not give an answer at all, or to give a bad answer, or to stutter a bunch. It's way better to just pause for just a bit and then answer the question. One other side effect that this has, and I'm sure Lawrence can attest to this, is that if you pause for a little bit, the sort of bit of talking that has stopped happening will cause the judge to look at you. Because most of the time, the judges are looking at the person asking the question. But if you give them time to focus on you, will you build up a face of righteous indignation and an answer to a question? That's completely okay. I know, for example, that in like kind of advanced varsity level debates with some of my best debaters, they kind of just think that if someone asks them a question, they have to respond instantly without thinking. And even at the upper levels, that's really not the way to go.
Yeah, I frequently stop paying attention when Martin is talking to me in real life, and it's only when he stops talking for that brief second that I start paying attention to what he has to say again, and that same concept applies in cross-examination.
What was that, Lawrence? Did you say something?
No.
Okay, good. So moving on to types of questions out of the mechanics section. Pretty basic. You want to be talking most of the time, and you want to face the judge. Okay, so let's go into some types of questions. The first type, and kind of the most obvious type, are what's called clarification question. Lawrence, what's a clarification question?
I'm sorry, what? Can you clarify that for me?
So I will clarify some words. What I meant by what is stop being stupid, and is a clarification question. I mean, Lawrence, answer the question.
Oh, okay. So a clarification question is just a question to reattain like already known information or to clarify a point that was a little vague to begin with. So the most basic type of clarification question is just like, what was your value or what was your first contention tagline? And these are not the questions that you want to spend cross-ex asking, because if you're asking them, either your opponent was literally incomprehensible or you just need to get more practice with flowing.
Yeah, that's definitely true. However, you know, let's not rag on clarification questions, too much. Um, because the reality of the situation is so like look, Lawrence is right. Like at a certain point you're just going to need to learn how to flow and like take notes in an effective way. Um, but if aren't quite at that level yet, if you don't know what your opponent's criterion is, you better find out.
Oh yeah, you shouldn't be afraid to ask clarification questions when necessary. Our goal is just to reduce the amount of times that it is necessary to ask clarification questions.
Yeah, definitely true. So if something is confusing, you should feel free to ask a question to say like, so let's say you just did not understand your opponent's first criterion warrant. It was just a bunch of gibberish. You think they mentioned Kant and Rawls in there a couple times, but you're really not sure. You wrote down the words rationality and compliance, which certainly do not help understand why their criterion of deontology is correct. So you usually like, is it rationality? Is it compliance? I could just make something up when I'm answering this. Or I could, use cross-ex time to figure out what it means. You say, okay, so the first warrant for your criterion, what was the main argument there? So definitely a necessary evil, but also don't don't use all of your time on these. Okay, so Lawrence, how should you generally word a clarification question? And to be more specific, here's an example of a clarification question that I could ask, and I want you to tell me whether this is bad or really bad. So, I would say, what was the tagline for your contention one?
And I'm going to go with pretty bad, because you've asked something that hopefully was pretty clear in the first place. And I think you could easily replace that with something along the lines of, what was the warrant for your first contention? Or can you explain the first contention further? Or what was, can you restate it in your own words even? That's not great, but it's still probably better than just straight up asking, what is your first contention tagline?
Well, so that's 100% correct. Another thing that I want to emphasize about that is like, look, people really want to ask about taglines for things. People really want to say, what is the introduction to your point? Give me like a one-sentence summary. In reality, though, if you ask your opponent, instead of asking your opponent for just a one-sentence summary of their thing, if you ask them for the reasoning behind their point, they will kind of be forced to give you the original argument. For example, if my first contention was like macaroni and cheese is delicious or something, like that was the tagline, and you're just like, okay, what was the tagline of your first contention? And you're like, macaroni and cheese is delicious, and you're like, okay. So you've learned something, but you haven't really learned a lot because you haven't learned what the justifications were for my point. However, if you said, what was the warrant? What was the internal logic of your contention one? And then I said,
Yeah.
my argument is that macaroni and cheese is tasty because blah 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 blah.
Insert study, random, like,
Yeah.
anecdote, something like that. Yeah.
And the point is, they've said the tagline. They put that there. Basically, you got them to give you the tagline plus something else.
Yeah.
Another disadvantage to asking for taglines is that it make it look like you just weren't paying attention at all.
Yeah. As a judge, if the first question out of someone's mouth is just, can you restate what your first contention tagline was again? I've already zoned out of cross-examination.
To be fair, you just did that before the debate, though.
Okay. So I was slightly paying attention, and then every little last drop of attention that I had just slipped away as soon as that question came out during cross-examination.
I kind of like drop of attention. Like, is it just like a liquid that just like drains out of you?
Yeah, and it just oozes onto the floor as my attention just melts away as I listen to the first cross-ex question being, what is your value?
So like it melts away, like it's like a metallic liquid.
I think you're reading too far into the words that I choose.
In what way am I reading into them? I kind of just said a bunch of words. I was listening to you. I wasn't reading. It's not written down.
I give up. You win.
That's right. We did it. Yes. Okay. So two other ways that you should not ask clarification questions. One, don't ask for a thesis of their case. The thesis of their case is just that their contentions and their criterion match. It's going to be the same thing every time.
Or
So
like the resolution is a good idea.
yeah, it,
You know.
yeah, yeah. It's like, what's your thesis? That the United States ought to guarantee right to housing. It's like, and then like I see someone write it down, and they're like, thank you, and I'm like, what? You should have known that going in.
I mean, it'd be
Um,
weird if their case thesis was basically anything else, you know?
what if you just like asked your opponent their case thesis, and they just like said the other side of the resolution? I mean, you just like clarified it with them a bunch of time, and they're like, yes. They're like,
I'd
yes,
sit
my
down.
argument is that right to housing is bad. I
Perfect. I'd sit down. End of
I
process.
would probably just like raise my eyebrows, like look really confused, and be like, "Are you sure? How sure are you?" What if you do that for like 2 minutes, and then at the very end they're like, "Oh wait, sorry, the opposite."
I'm pretty sure you've still won the debate at that point because I'm not sure as a judge I could vote for someone for someone who for 2 minutes of cross-ex said the exact opposite of the resolution of
What
their
if
side.
what if someone like read their AF case, and then you cross-sex them about it, and they just started listing off neg contentions? Like they like it wasn't what they talked about in the case; it was their neg case, and they were just like, and they just like started going off. Like, let's say you're just like, what was your first contention? And they're like, oh yeah, negative rights are always bad, so we shouldn't, or sorry, positive rights are bad, so we should never guarantee a right to housing. It's like, wait, what?
I'm not sure what I would do as a debater. As a judge, I'd start laughing, I'm sure.
Oh yes. Another thing is, don't ask your opponent for a summary in their own words, quote unquote. Instead, just ask them something that isn't written down, so they just have to explain it in their own words.
Yeah.
Instead
I mean,
instead of saying, "Please use your words for this," just ask them a question that requires that they use their words.
yeah. I mean, it's better than just straight up asking, "Hey, what's the contention tagline again?" But we'd prefer that you do neither of those.
Also, if you ask a question in cross-ex, and then like a minute goes by, and then you ask the exact same question word for word, I'm totally fine with that being grounds for tournament disqualification. I think you
It's
should.
a
I think you just lost your right to play the game. You're done. You're out of there.
it's a good thing that you're not running tournaments then.
Yeah, I guess so.
Speaking of you not running tournaments, did you know that it'd be a bad idea if you ran a tournament?
Yes. So, the next set of questions, as sort of shrewdly alluded to by my co-host Lawrence here, is that you should not ask questions that are like, "Did you know?" questions. And so some types of "Did you know?" questions are like really good, and there's one type of them, but basically, you should not ask your opponent if they are aware of facts. There is no non-awkward way for someone to respond to that, and it just makes you look like kind of a fool. So one of the types of ways that you can ask is you could say, "Hey, are you aware of this negative argument I'm going to read?"
And the affirmative will either respond with, yes, I have answers to it, or no, I don't, because I didn't do work, in which case, okay.
Yeah. In the second scenario, look at it this way. If you have a negative case and you're just like, "Hey, are you aware that hate speech is bad?" And your opponent is like, "Whoa, I completely never thought of that." Like you were just gonna win that debate anyway. Like, what is your opponent doing? How do they not know that hate speech is a thing? So the point is, those are very like not good questions. Your questions should not be shoddily covered up contention arguments. They should not be. You should not say, Are you aware that your argument is wrong?" It's not like your opponent's going to say, "Ah, ha, ha, yes, my mistake." Um, they will not do that.
At least they should not do that. And you should not do that either if you're asked this question.
Yes. Do not concede your AF and cross examination. You heard it here first. Um, so do not test awareness. Also, don't say, "Were you aware that this thing existed?" Because if you're like, "Yes," then you're just like, "Prove it." or if they're like, no, that's irrelevant, and then you're like, why isn't it irrelevant? And it's just like, it leads to really just awkward, stupid stuff. So the best way to ask one of these questions is to say, hey, you said, you said a thing. However, there is this obvious bit of common knowledge that contradicts your thing. So how can you possibly be right? It's kind of the basic format of the question. And one good way to ask this is also to prove contradictions between points in someone's case. Like, let's say you thought someone had contradictory points in their case, then you can ask your opponent in cross-ex to kind of explain how they have two contradictory things. It could be like, you say this, but you also said this. How is it possible for those things to be together? That's kind of a legitimate form of asking this question. And it's actually a pretty good question. You can say, for example, like, let's say you're on the AF on the free speech topic, and your opponent makes a constitutionality negative argument for some reason. Then a decent way of asking a question could be like, so you say that negating is constitutional, but every single court in the United States that's ever heard a case on a speech code has ruled it unconstitutional. So what Supreme Court precedent are you citing to prove that it's constitutional? Or something like that. Like a much more specific question. Instead of just saying, did you know that hate speech is the total worst? It's not like they're going to be like, yeah, I definitely think that hate speech is just 100% the worst. I will concede my case, and bend down on the ground for you to walk over me. That's never happened to my knowledge in a debate. All right, so the next set kind of question thing is contradictions. So one thing that you want to do, and I kind of mentioned this before, is use questions to point out contradictions in your opponent's case. So you can say, you say this, but you also say this. How are these things separate? Like, let's say, for example, on the free speech topic, someone has a negative case, and they make their contention one is that we should keep every speech code except for hate speech codes. And then their second contention says we should keep every speech codes except for this other code. Then you could say, like, how can it be true? You said we should only have these speech codes, but then you say we should only have this speech codes. Which of these is accurate? Something like that.
Yeah, or an affirmative that was like, we only keep hate speech codes, but then reads a contention that is like more free speech solves hate speech. And that could be a potential point of contradiction where you could be like, wait, which one of these is it?
Yeah, especially this is true if you would do what's called double turn yourself. A double turn is a phrase that means if you make an argument that your opponent causes more of something and that thing is good at the same time. If you make kind of two separate arguments, if you say, if you do what's called a link turn and an impact turn at the same time, that's what's called a double turn. So one example of this is something that happened on last year's January-February topic. On that topic, there was a common negative argument that if you banned handguns, that would cause other types of more lethal guns to surface instead. And then negatives also sometimes made an argument about self-defense. They made an argument that handguns were good because they were so dangerous and therefore could be used to fend off criminals. And if you didn't word this correctly, you could end up double turning yourself, because you could basically say, hey, handguns are good for self-defense. We need guns to defend ourselves with. Also, in your world, people have a bunch more guns to defend themselves with, aka shotguns. So there was like a potential point of contradiction there. And the point here is you could ask a cross-examination question. You could say, hey, So you said self-defense is good, and we need kind of personal guns to do that. But then you say I lead to an increase in personal guns. So how do those two things square with each other?
Yeah, and even on this housing topic, a lot of negatives are reading rights-based negatives that are like negative rights are really good. They're key to, like the government needs to respect more negative rights. And then on the affirmative case, are reading arguments like rights focus bad or rights discourse bad or human rights being bad. And these two are obviously in tension because the negative is both claim that rights are good and simultaneously bad. And that's something that affirmatives could easily exploit on this topic.
Wow, I totally didn't even think of that. That's actually just a really, really good cross-examination strategy. That's actually
Yeah,
just really good. I'm gonna tell my kids to do that. That's gas. It's really good.
I never told any of the debaters that I was judging, mostly because you can't give post-round decisions in Oklahoma during the district tournament. But I noticed a few negatives doing this, and it sort of just bothered me when they were like, rights are so good, and then on the affirmative case, rights are so bad.
On At the Florida State tournament I was just at, we had a piece of paper and it said in all caps, there will be no disclouse in LD or PF.
Oh gosh.
Which, in case you couldn't tell, is a misspelling of disclosure, but it's also a misspelling by two separate letters in different parts of the word. It was glorious. But so I did not disclose or disclose the entirety of the tournament. Okay, so the next bad type of question, or sorry, this is the next type of question. The last type of question that we just gave was not a bad kind of question. It was a good one. So one bad type of question is, hey, if I prove sort of this condition, do I win?
This question bothers me so much.
Yeah, and because it bothers you so much, would you like to tell us why?
So either you should already theoretically know the answer to it, because either the answer is no, because the other debater will be smart enough to list about 50 other conditions necessary for you to win, or the question will be so broad that you're functionally asking, if I negate the resolution, do I win? And it's like, yes, if you've like won that the resolution is like false or not moral or something like that, you obviously win. So like these questions are just so silly because they either open you up to just debaters dumping conditions for wins, or they're just so totally useless because they just devolve into, so if I win that you should negate, do you negate?
Here's the thing. Like, if you're asking this question, one of two things is true. One, you don't know the answer. If you don't know the answer, don't ask this question. Ask a different type of question. Ask clarification questions. You should know the answer. You should understand, what your win conditions are, sort of roughly speaking. You should have some idea of what it will take to win a debate, whether it's making a turn to your opponent's case, winning underneath their criterion, winning your criterion, etc. You should be aware of those conditions. And if you're not, ask different questions that are clarification questions to get at that stuff. So if you're unsure, now let's say you're sure. If you're sure that your opponent will answer no to your question, then it's just the most stupid question in the world. Most of the time people ask this question when they think the answer is yes. But if you think that the answer to this question is yes, aka if you say, if I prove this, do I win? If you think that they'll say yes to that question, there is no possible response they can give you that will really satisfy you. Because the only time people would ever say yes to this question is if it was blatantly obvious. And if it was blatantly obvious, you should have already known that that was going to be the case. But here's the thing, as Lauren said, it's actually way worse than that. Because what most debaters will do is if you say, if I do this, then I win. And let's say you're pretty sure they're going to say yes. And then they just say no. Then you awkwardly have to say, hey, why not? Which is a really awkward question. And then they'll be like, oh, you have to do these other 5 things. And here's the thing. You may not have had to do those 5 things at all. It was probably the case that you didn't. But asking them the question gives them the opportunity to just invent a bunch of stuff. Instead, just keep the question on the inside. Know what it takes to win a round on something, and then go ahead and do that. You don't need to ask them a question. If you're wondering kind of what your opponent's criterion means, and you need to know what a turn would be that would negate under your opponent's criterion, that's a fine question to ask, and that kind of borders on this one. But don't ask like, hey, if I prove that you increase homelessness, do I win the debate? Let's say their criterion is minimizing homelessness. So like, either they'll say the wrong answer, which is no, you also need to do this other stuff. And then you just get into a kind of a weird debate where you're like, no, I don't have to do the other stuff. And they're like, yes, you do. Then you just get into a shouting match. Or, they'll just say, I suppose if you turn my contentions, then you win. But everyone already knew that.
Yeah. Just assert it in the speech anyways. Like, why open yourself up to this awkward line of questioning that would ensue if you ask, if I prove this, do I win?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I remember that. Okay, so the next section we have is not a type of questions. This is the thing that we'll talk about before we get to kind of the advanced section here. We're still on the basics in terms of question types, etc. Okay, so this is an important point that I want you all to realize. So follow-ups are key. Asking your opponent a question and getting an unsatisfactory answer should definitely be cause for you to ask a further question. Like, let's say you say, what is the warrant in your contention 2? And they say, my argument is that affirming minimizes homelessness. Like, that wasn't an explanation. Like, that was not a warrant. So the point is, you need to say, my question is, why is that true? Don't just say, oh yeah, silly me. It's like they didn't answer your question. People give incomplete answers to questions all the time, and you need to ask follow-up questions. The key is, though, you don't want to just ask, don't just say the word why after the question, because that gives them too much leeway to respond, you goof. Instead, you want to say something like, why is it that blah, 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 or why does that justify that blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, exactly. And just an open-ended why just leaves way too much room for your opponent to respond. But I also think that the question why also has a couple of interesting, unique properties within cross-ex, because I think that it's both undervalued and overused. And so what do I mean by this? Well, I think it's undervalued because not enough people ask sort of why follow-up questions. Like Martin was just talking about, they let people get away with unsatisfactory answers. Like, you'll just ask them for a warrant and they'll give you like a partial explanation. And then you're like, all right, cool, moving on. Well, now the judge is sort of sitting there like, why didn't you press them further? And your opponent is like, thank you for not pressing me further. And you've just wasted an opportunity. But I also think it's overused because I see a lot of debaters just only ask the question why. What's the warrant for the first contention? All right, why? Okay, why is that? Why? Why? All right, next contention. What's the warrant for that? Why? And that doesn't seem to demonstrate a debater that's really knowing what's going on. They don't really have control of the round. They're sort of just asking the question why. So I think it's really crucial to know exactly when to use the question of why in debates, because it's sometimes underused and it's sometimes overutilized, and both of which I think cost you points with the judge.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, so in the next section, we'll talk about advanced cross-examination strategies. All right, so this next section is advanced cross-examination tips. We're going to go sort of straight, in a straight, direct line into some more advanced considerations. The main thing that we want to talk about in this section is just that um, things are in cross-examination are strategic, and when you make a decision about what questions to ask your opponents, what questions to get asked, you should treat that as a decision. You should go into a cross-examination thinking, what do I want to accomplish? You should come when someone's asking you a question, when you're answering a question, those things cause a different set of decisions. But the important bit is just that we want you to be deciding. Now, Lawrence, have you ever made a decision?
No.
No, you haven't. So, um, how did you decide whether or not to answer my question?
You scripted it for me.
I didn't script it for you. Look, we are an incredibly unprofessional podcast. Sometimes I just we just completely make up the topic on the fly. Lawrence has no idea what I'm going to be talking about at any given moment, so he's forced to radically adapt. I come on the episode, I say, "Oh, this is a cross-examination episode," and then Lawrence, an internal Lawrence monologue is like, "Oh, Jiminy Cricket, I better think of something fast." Which is exactly how Lawrence talks in real life, if you've ever seen him.
No.
Okay, well, after that sterling standing ovation from Lawrence, let's talk about your strategy when you're cross-examining someone. Lawrence, when you've started the old cross-examination time, when you sat yourself down or stood yourself up for a nice little good cross-examination, what are the things that you want to be focusing on?
Well, there's a lot of different things that I want to focus on, but generally I sort of start off with the weakest points that were brought up in the last speech, and generally those weakest points would be the most preposterous or the most outlandish or ridiculous arguments, and I like to sort of start there because I think it's sort of good perceptually and strategically to just isolate the argument that you think that your opponent is just going to lose on in the future.
That's definitely true, and I want to get into the substance of that in a second, but Lawrence, that was a really good word you used there. Outlandish. What is that like? I wonder where that word came from. Like of the outlands? Of or related to outlands? Outlandish?
I wish I knew. I just know that it means something.
It means something. It's good to know that a word that Lawrence used means something. That's a certainly an important thing. Um,
Apparently, it is was used to describe foreigners, and then used later to describe foreigners that like were silly or unfamiliar or strange, and then that's why we use the term outlandish.
it's a great word. I'm gonna try to incorporate that more into my stuff. Anyway, onto the substance of what you said. So, in front of a lot of judges, especially lay judges, who sometimes find it difficult to cover the full pace of a debate, and maybe they don't know the difference between offense and defense. Maybe they aren't as exactly attuned. Maybe they have difficulty remembering because they're not very good at writing things down. But cross examination is a good time for them to see people combating each other. Now, we've already mentioned all of this, but the thing is, in front of those sorts of judges, really, it's less important that you be right about the most important issues in the debate, and more that you be right. Like, very right. If your opponent says something really, really bad, you want to expose them. You want to just absolutely expose them, much like it's good for Lawrence to be exposed. Generally, you wanna expose your opponent as much as possible. Hone in on the stupid thing that they say, and by hone I mean take it and sort of sharpen it. I think that's what the word hone means, right? Um, I don't know if that's what the word hone in on. Hone in is kind of just like look at things and kind of, I don't know, like squint. Is that kind of like what hone in means?
Yeah, but to hone your skills means to sort of sharpen or improve them.
Yeah, but if you're honing in on something, you're
Then
not
yeah, you're
you're not
tracking it.
yeah, yeah, you're not like sharpening on them, right?
Probably not.
Yeah, I don't know. uh, what that would mean. So yeah, just like in video games, you kind of want to hone in on the weak spots. If you're in a debate and you notice that your opponent has a lot of like sort of blinking orange nodes on them that from all your video game knowledge, nodes of space where you can score a critical hit. Generally, you want to focus on those points. And if your opponent has some weak stuff, like let's say they have some weak example for their value criterion, or they have some weak contention level arguments and stuff like that, this would be a time where really focusing on those can have beneficial outcomes.
Yeah, like it weirds me out as a judge when people, for example, read a criterion of like just deontology, which isn't, technically a criterion. They literally just say the criterion is deontology. And then they sort of read some arguments about how the theory of deontology means that we should maximize like some good, and usually it's like autonomy or something, but they use the word maximize in there, and as you know from the, one of the recent episodes that we did, that's just incorrect. And it confuses me when debaters start their cross-sects, not by asking about this very obviously incorrect argument that you should know already is wrong, but instead will be like, I'm sorry, can you repeat the first tagline of your first contention? And I'm sitting there as a judge like, why haven't you pushed on obviously the most ridiculous argument that the affirmative has forwarded, which is that deontology is a utilitarian theory of ethics?
I think that if you ask your opponent what the tagline is for their first contention, you should so how people often ask you like, can you repeat the first tagline of your first contention? I think that should only be a legitimate cross-examination tactic if you ask them to do it 5 times in a row.
I mean, as a judge, I can't say I'd be thrilled to hear it 5 times in a row, but if you want to go for it.
Would your opponent just like think you were in the Matrix if you just asked the same question with like the same tone of voice, just like repeatedly for like a minute? It's like, can you repeat the tagline of your first contention? And then like your opponent does it, and it's like, can you repeat the tagline of your first contention? Your opponent would start to get really weirded out. One more time, can you repeat the tagline of your first contention? Oh, I don't know. Something about that would be very funny. If you're debating in front of me, you should do that. If I know that you're ironically doing that, I'll give you really high speaker points. That would just be the greatest. Okay, so there's 2 other things that are good things to do when you are cross-sexing someone, when you are the one asking the questions. So the number 1 we just talked about: isolate their weak points, grill them on those weak points. Just put them on the George Foreman, let them cook for 1 minute and 20 seconds, and then flip it over and ask another question or something. Okay, so grill them on that. And the second thing, though, is ask for article titles if you know that their article is an affirmative article, especially if that's obvious from the title. So I don't know about you, but I've seen plenty of just cross-exes and debates basically just ended on the spot by asking someone to reveal the article title for one of their pieces of evidence. Is that true? Have you?
Yeah, I mean, I witnessed it as a judge like maybe once or twice, and I definitely try to do it a lot as a debater.
Yeah, I know that one of one of one of the best cross examinations that I've seen was actually around at a debate camp between someone who would go on to get to the finals of a lot of national tournaments, someone named Richard Schmickler, and he was debating against another pretty good debater from Iowa named Taylor Amy, and they were having a debate, and the affirmative read their case, and then the negative, which was Richard, said, "Okay, so you read this article in your case. Can you read to us the first paragraph of the article?" And the kid was like, "Oh, okay." So he pulls up the article, and the paragraph that he reads is just devastatingly the exact opposite of what he said in the debate. Like, it wasn't just the author being like, "Well, I disagree with that conclusion." It was like, no one should ever advocate for, and then like his argument. He's like, no one should ever do this. No one should ever cite me in this way ever again. And it was just like just a bunch of just devastating rhetoric. And the debate was perceptually just over at that point.
So what happened after that?
Well, so then the negative cross-examiner, Richard, was like, so I'd like you to concede this piece of evidence. And then Taylor was like, yes, I will do this. So not only did he basically lose the debate perceptually on the spot, he also just lost his evidence immediately. Which is pretty nice. So asking for article titles, this, by the way, is one of the real benefits of doing topic research. Like, if you just know that their article is a commonly cited negative article or a commonly cited affirmative article on the other side, then just asking them to read their article title and cross-ex can just really just expose them. You know, really give them the old expose. Do you have anything else to add here, Lawrence?
Well, yeah, like for example, in this topic, there's a negative card that's being read a lot by Chester Hartman, which is like the right to housing is like hard to enforce or something like that. But if you read the article title, it's called like the case for a right to housing.
Yeah, Hartman is just like the just like OG app article.
Yeah, and so it sort of confuses me that ends up in a lot of negative documents. So, it's not just the negative cross-exing the app about this. The app should also do the same to the negative.
Yeah, I remember that this was great. A bunch of people on the qualified immunity topic were reading negative cards from someone named Hassel, and but the article title of the Hassel article was like "Living a Lie: The Problems with the Qualified Immunity Doctrine." So once I saw at a tournament that it was actually in the novice division that a bunch of people were reading the Hassel evidence on the negative, I just told them to expose their opponents by asking about the article title and cross-examination, and they did that in a couple rounds and like auto won those rounds. It was just glorious. This can be really important perceptually, and basically, if you reveal that the author disagrees with your opponent's evidence, your opponent basically can't extend the evidence. So that is a good piece of cross-examination strategy. Okay, and the third thing that you want to do that is strategic to do in cross-examination is to ask questions about some stuff that you might not have the time to address in your speech. I mean, LD speeches are pretty short. When you want to address a point that your opponent has made, sometimes it's just not really, like, you won't have the time in your speech to do it. So sometimes it helps to shorten the amount of time that you'll need to spend in your speech making a point by making it in cross-examination. Lawrence, do you have an example of a time where that might be more accurate, like a sort of type of argument?
I'm not sure if I have one off the top of my head.
Where is the top of your head?
It's at the bottom of the top of my head.
The top of your head is at the bottom of the top of your head?
Yeah.
Where is that relative to the west of your head?
I don't know what west means.
Yeah, Cornel West is actually a pretty influential author in African American studies, and that's what I was talking about. I'm offended, Lawrence.
That's good.
I just want to let you know that you're being offensive right now.
Good.
Yeah. So, anyway, back to what I was saying. One thing that you might want to do, one type of evidence that this really applies to is stuff like studies. Sometimes if your opponent reads a poll, it's not really that cost efficient to say, like, to use your speech explaining why phone polls are bad, or explaining why certain types of polls are less accurate than other types of polls. Instead, it's much better to kind of like set the stage for those arguments, and by that I mean like clear off the stage from the previous performance and like set up various props and make sure that your actors are on time and well paid. So you want to set the stage for your performance, make sure that your actors are well paid and the props are set up for your argument by sort of peppering them with questions, sprinkling them as if you would with pepper. And you want to say something like, Oh, I see you used a phone poll. So how many people did it survey? Oh, that seems like a pretty small number of people. You're talking about the entire United States? What was the survey method? Just like using that as a way of casting doubt on stuff where it would take you a really long time to explain those things in your speech, you can just use cross-examination um, to do that for you. Um, yeah. Do you agree, Lawrence?
Yeah, and I actually recall watching sort of a video of an online cross-examination where the negative stands up and asks the affirmative about this piece of evidence, and at some point, like maybe two or three questions in, he asks, "Oh, can you list, like, can you talk about the sort of qualifications of your author and like how this study was conducted?" And this person is forced to answer a bunch of questions about this, and eventually, the negative debater who's cross-examining the affirmative points out that this author, A, was not qualified to talk about this, argument at all. B, was actually like horribly racist and had written articles something along the lines of like, why like you should not allow more Hispanics within like STEM research studies or something like that. And that the methodology of the study that he had used just straight up was designed to come to the conclusion of a bunch of racist things at the end of the study. And these are arguments that would have been really troublesome to forward during an entire speech time because it took him like a good minute of cross-ex to lead the affirmative debater in this direction. But using cross-examination to set up these sort of arguments, things that you wouldn't otherwise have time in a speech to do, was really perceptually powerful because it got basically everyone in the audience to start laughing at this guy's author because he was just like horribly unqualified to write about anything.
Did you write for like globalresearch.ca?
I have no idea. This was like a policy debate a long time ago, but I think the sort of general principle of just like, hey, your evidence is horribly unqualified and your author is laughably bad at, whatever field of study they're in, I think is a good thing to sort of forward during cross-ex.
Yeah, and it casts doubt on the rest of your opponent's evidence too, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like if they have one piece of evidence and it's so bad. I mean, like that doesn't necessarily mean all the evidence is bad, but perceptually, like your evidence definitely looks superior to theirs. The judge is thinking like their evidence could just be just as bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was strategy for when you're cross-examining someone. Now let's talking about when you are being cross-examined. This is just as important as the other stuff. It happens just as often. I hate to break it to you, Lawrence, but getting cross-exed happens just as often as cross-examining. Um, and you have a lot less control over what happens when you are being cross-examined. So you have to have the appropriate methods to combat your opponent's aggression and let them know that that won't stand, man. Um, so first thing, and this is extremely important. Um, you the general strategy for when you're getting cross-examined is talk as much as possible until they cut you off. Now, Lawrence, why is that?
There's a bunch of different reasons, really. I think the first and most obvious is you should just treat it as extra speech time. Like you're just getting more time given to you by your opponent to explain, re-explain, further explain, offer more examples, like better defend your arguments, etc. In like basically free speech time, things that are not allotted into your typical, 13 minutes of speech, because you have 3 minutes to answer questions and, say your arguments over and over again. And psychology is like pretty clear on this, that the more that you explain an argument to someone or the more that you tell it to them, the more likely they are to believe it. So maybe they didn't fully understand it, or maybe the judge didn't fully believe your argument the first time they heard it. But 3 extra minutes of explaining your argument in a much more conversational, much more direct manner, where you're not as scripted and you're more just telling them, in very simplistic terms, this is what my argument is speech time that you should not, waste. You shouldn't just give like one-word answers usually and move on. There might be instances where that's necessary, but, you should talk for as long as possible and treat it as part of a speech.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Treat it as extra speech time. As Lawrence said, the more they hear your stuff, the more likely they are to think that you are right about your stuff. Keep going until they cut you off, pretty much. Now, there's a type of question that or a type of answer people give in cross-examination all the time, or at least newer people, and it just drives me nuts. So, Lawrence, what would you say if so? Let's say, okay, Lawrence, just ask me a cross-examination question about one of my contentions.
What is the warrant to your second contention?
Oh, the warrant in my second contention is in my Williams evidence. Would you like me to explain it?
Oh, no, that's fine. I totally understand it now. What is the warrant in your third contention?
Oh, that's the Marcuse evidence. Would you like me to explain it?
No, I think I'm good. That'll be cross-ex. I'll take prep time now.
No! I just blew a bunch of opportunities to explain what my card said. And instead,
Oh,
I asked the person cross-examining me whether they really wanted to hear it. Don't give them the choice, you goobers. You know, if your opponent asks you a question and the answer to it is in your Williams evidence, just tell them what the Williams evidence is. That's what they're asking about. Don't 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 tell them, "Hey, would you like me to answer the question you just asked?" Because they'll just be like, nah. Or they'll say, "Yeah," and then you're just the same thing as if you had just ranted about your argument.
but instead you wasted time and looked silly.
Instead, you look like the silliest goose. So, you heard it here on the podcast. Don't be a silly goose. If you are a goose and are offended by this podcast, send a strongly worded email to theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, and we will send counter hate mail as swiftly as possible, as the important Lawrence can confirm, after we sent them a barrage of angry comments about their personal life. So, yeah, just explain your argument if that's what they asked. Talk as much as possible. Another thing, and we already talked about this before, but it's totally okay to pause before you answer a question. It's way worse to say something dumb when you could just instead say something smart with a little more time. Plus, you get the judge to focus on you. I think we already mentioned this part. One thing that I wanted to mention about this is, so we just talked about talking as much as possible until someone cuts you off. This also means that when you are cross-examining someone, you should take this into account. Don't let them talk forever. It's okay for you to cut them off. I normally would raise my hand and kind of lower it down a little bit in sort of like a calming fashion. If I need to say, okay, I'd like to ask another question. If you're Lawrence, you would probably screech, "This is my cross-ex," before going on to win nationals.
I did it every round. In prelims, throughout rounds, every round. This is my cross-ex.
This is my cross-ex. And then he just went back to his normal sultry Lawrence force. So, hey kids, the Lockean social contract is the darn tootin' best. This is my cross-ex. Those are Lawrence loves to debate at the just ends of the extremes, of life and debate.
Yeah, and one sort of counterpoint is, usually when you are being cross-exed, you do want to talk as much as possible because, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's extra speech time, reinforcing the argument in the judge's memory. The more that you say it, the more likely the judge is to believe it, et cetera, et cetera. But there are occasionally times where you might actually not want to go on super long rants and just give really short answers. It's not very often that you want to do this, but there are moments. And usually this involves less experienced debaters than you. So some people will try to trip you up by asking, for example, yes or no questions where they really want you to just give super long and complicated answers. And sometimes instead of going on long rants about obscure yes or no questions, sometimes it's better to just say yes or no. Or some people will try to ask filler questions in cross-examination, especially people who don't know how to do cross-examination. And so they'll be like, can you explain your first contention? And so you explain it as quickly as possible and you're sort of done. And I've actually found that sometimes this helps because the less experienced debater will just sit there and they'll be silent and they don't know what else to ask. And that actually makes you look more in charge. Well, I mean, it's true. I don't like see I didn't see a need to like explain my first contention for a full like 45 seconds. I would just generally give like a well, you know that I think housing is good because you know homelessness is bad or something like that. It doesn't really require that much explanation. And some people will just like expect more because they're just trying to desperately fill their cross-ex time because they don't know what to ask. And so if you can sometimes get the hint from the other debater that they don't know what to ask, it might be okay to just give short answers and sort of let your opponent flounder there. Again, this is not the optimal strategy because if you have a more complicated case, for instance, you should definitely spend that time warranting your argument or re-explaining to the judge. But occasionally, there are times where just like short answers will do.
Speaking of a short answer, that wasn't one. Um, but to seize on something that Lauren said. So we talked in the last section about, getting your opponent's weak spots, identifying the sort of critical hit bonus multiplier areas of your opponent's weaknesses and exploiting those with your fangs and claws. And so basically what we're saying is that you as sort of like a jungle creature should seize upon the weak spots of your opponent. And if you see your opponent sort of walking through the jungle with a meaty calf exposed, and that meaty calf happens to be they're a novice and are looking to fill time, so instead just make them flounder. Feel free to sort of leap and sink your teeth and claws into that area of them. However, most of the time you shouldn't debate as if you're debating against those people,
Oh
because
yeah,
if you are, you're probably going to win anyway. So it's like,
right.
why would you warp your strategy? Instead, I would default to explaining your argument more.
I'd also say that one other thing to sort of add is don't rant when you're talking for as much as possible. You should make sure that everything that you're saying has some purpose, even if you're just listing different examples to sort of make the argument of concept more accessible or more understandable. But just saying the same thing over and over isn't particularly good for you if you're just literally saying the same like three sentences over and over and over again. So know when to stop or get better at replacing that repetition with something unique or interesting.
So what you're saying is that we should make sure to replace our repetition with something unique and interesting?
I believe that is something along the lines of what I just said.
So do you think we should eliminate repetition and replace it with something unique and interesting?
I'm now doubting everything that I've just said.
Okay, well, that's the entire point of this podcast, was just to take Lawrence's knowledge, just like his ingrained knowledge, and just convince him that everything is a lie and that he lives in cyberspace. Speaking of cyberspace, we're having this conversation through cyberspace, and we have a wife and kids to get back home to. That's actually a total lie. But let's finish the podcast. Um, before we get into, so we have two things left to talk about before the conclusion, and our, like argument clinic exclusive segment mini debate. So first thing is we have a bunch of just random tips to talk about. And then next thing we have is war stories. So some random tips. First is confidence. For a lot of judges, confidence is a proxy for winningness. Winnidence. Confidence is a proxy for winnidence. And if a judge sees that you are confident, then they are more likely to believe what you're saying. What you're saying comes across as more legit, and you will just feel better about the whole enterprise. Lawrence, have you ever been confident?
I'm not confident about anything right now, but I definitely pretended to be confident as a debater, and as a judge, I definitely prefer it when debaters pretend to be confident, even if they're not.
Yeah, fake it till you make it, as I always say, especially with confidence. I think it's kind of funny that like a lot of times cross-examination and debate is just a bunch of introverts trying really hard to pretend to be confident.
Yeah, it's like kind of weird for me because I definitely like wasn't good at public speaking and probably still am not very good at public speaking, but by nature. But debate forced me to like pretend to be confident about what I was saying or pretend to be like smart or in control or something like that. And it wasn't probably that much of an issue my sophomore, junior, senior years, where I actually had the content knowledge to defend my beliefs. But as a freshman, I didn't really know that much. And going against like older senior debaters or junior debaters who had more experience than me, who were smarter than I was, I would just lose to them a lot if I didn't have confidence. And I just like remember a few debates like young freshman or sophomore year me where I basically knew nothing about debate. Like I maybe knew like 2 stock negative arguments, and all I could do was kind of explain these over and over again. But because I just had confidence, occasionally I could pull off wins over older debaters, just basically because the judge was like, the neg was more confident, therefore they must be right. Therefore, I will vote on this argument that makes them right. And as you said earlier, just use that as a proxy for winningness.
I was definitely quite confident in my novice cross-examinations. Then I lost a bit of confidence, and then I got it back towards the end of my debate career. One important question I have before we move on to random tips, Lawrence, do you think it's important for us to replace repetition with sort of our own unique and interesting phrases?
I am no longer confident in my answer.
Okay, good. So if you have a problem with replacing your repetition with unique and interesting phrases, send a strongly worded carrier pigeon to the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com, and we'll be sure to send our own carrier pigeon in response, which we've trained to insult you in all of the most delicate but incisive ways. Other tips: be knowledgeable. Knowing about the topic really just improves your cross-examination skills so much. Knowing about, this is going to sound really cheesy, but knowing things makes you better at both answering and asking questions. There is a limit to the amount that you can get away with confidence. You need to know what the resolution means. You need to have some working knowledge of the arguments. Otherwise, when they ask you questions, you will be exposed.
Yeah, confidence is just not enough of a substitute for knowledge, and obviously knowledge enough itself is not a substitute for confidence either, because if you know stuff but you're very, unconfident about in the way that you say it, and you're very timid and shy, and you don't convey to the judge that you think that you're right, then that knowledge doesn't translate to anything. But confidence can only get you so far either. Like as a freshman, sort of blustering my way around, as soon as you hit someone who is both confident and knowledgeable, you're going to lose. And that happened a lot to me. Even later in my career. So having knowledge is a good substitute for confidence, because you can if you know stuff, you can be confident that you actually know stuff. It seems, pretty simple, and yet a lot of people still don't do as much work on the topic as they need to. And just the more knowledge you have about the topic and the content that is being read in this debate, the more likely you're going to be really good at cross-examination.
As renowned Buddhist monk and scholar Zenyatta once said, confidence is a flimsy shield. So, you'll need knowledgeable. You need to be knowledgeable about topics that will give you a sort of more sustainable shield. The third tip is be polite, unless you're Martin, in which case you should yell at your opponents all the time. But being polite can, I think as our resident Oklahoman, I think Lawrence is in a pretty good position to inform us all about politeness and how that's a thing.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma is characterized by that Southern charm, is that what they call it? I wouldn't really know, but and I think that a lot of the debates that I had in high school were very polite. Like everyone had sort of a general sense of decorum. They sort of weren't yelling at each other. They weren't insulting each other. They would dress up in formal clothes. They would address the judge and their opponent with respect usually. And I think that just being polite makes judges sort of want to vote for you, because no one really wants to vote for impolite debaters. Like the more rude you are, the more likely that the judge is looking for reasons to vote against you, or looking for reasons to sort of drop your speaker points, and none of which are good things. And in cross-examination, that shows especially, because you can sort of fake it in speech time, because you're really just giving a speech. But in cross-ex, when you're directly comparing to someone and you're just being really mean to them, well, the judge doesn't really like that. I certainly, as a judge, would hate to vote for someone that is rude. I'd be looking for basically anything anything out there to sort of vote down the rude debater. And just being polite, I think, is just, good for you as a person and good for you as a debater.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, you just have to have a certain level of, people have told me I need to have a certain level of decorum in debate rounds, but honestly, no one ever told me which quorum it was.
I think it's decorum,
Okay, thank
spelled
you.
DA-quorum.
DA// quorum. Is
Yeah.
that is that with a hyphen or is it with with an apostrophe?
It's a backslash, actually.
A backslash? Duh, quorum. Okay, so I intentionally left a bunch of blank space here because I remember last episode on the podcast, I kind of just like organically remembered a bad question that we hadn't brought up yet, and
Mm-hmm.
I forgot what it was. Do you remember
Yes, actually, hold on.
we caught it, but I don't remember what it was. I wanted to make sure that we hit it this time.
Um, holy crap! Now this bothers me now.
Yeah, I do.
Um,
We're just we're just we're gonna need to think of this, but it's just gonna kill us for like 10 minutes.
okay. All right. Did you know that? Would you agree that? Did did you know? If I do this, do I win? Why?
We should have written this down. That was a fucking audible.
God.
I'm just racking my brains to think of bad rounds.
Oh, man. I did judge one round in round 3 of our district tournament, which was a pad, and his cross-ex of the AF was, what was your value criterion, first contention, second contention, sits there for like literally 30 seconds in silence, asks one more question about the warrant of the first contention, sits down. That was
Yeah,
bad. But
that's
that
classic.
wasn't even it. Come on, what is it? Golly.
One of the debaters at the Florida State tournament asked two questions, and then was like, "That's all I need." I'm like, "You sure there, buddy? Looks like you're about to drop something." And drop things he did.
Dang it. What is the function of this? Why do
It's a good question. Okay, when did we think about this? Did we think about this during the war stories section?
I think so. Okay, so my war stories were um, semis of nationals, where I just talked about John Locke for a bunch, and getting just rolled by Schmickler. But I didn't even reference specific questions. So it was almost definitely from one of your war stories. So you had your Brian Wilder story.
Yeah, I had the Brian Wilder story. I had the really long one about state semis. I had the one where I asked my opponent if they knew what a criterion was. Um,
Maybe Google will tell us worst CX questions to ask.
yeah, this is just a fucking killer. It was one of those ones where we would instantly recognize it.
Oh yeah, oh gosh.
It's pathetic.
Would you repeat the question? I don't understand the question. Will you reward? Oh, golly.
Oh, will you explain it in your own words? Was that it?
No, because that was kind of referenced above earlier, like, because I talked about it in the first segment where I was like, at the very least, if you're going to ask clarification, explain in your own words, but prefer that you don't do that either. I definitely remember saying that. Oh, golly.
This is so depressing. Maybe we should just continue with the episode, and then hopefully we'll remember it in the natural course of doing
There's no way, though. I don't know. Like,
what we did last time. Watch Good Debaters and CrossX. Maybe we're talking about good debates. Like Danny Dubois maybe came up.
Yeah, he did, because I mentioned him. I'm gonna have to message someone. I would be like, send me the list of the worst cross-ex questions ever.
They won't think of it though.
Oh, you know who? Nails never responds. Never mind.
Whatever. We need to continue on, and then we can stop it again after this segment. And if we think about it on the fly, then we can just insert it.
Uh, okay, give me like 2 minutes.
Sure. I'm thinking.
I'm trying to read all of these PowerPoints and stuff. Ah.
Don't ask if your contentions are true. Don't ask them if they do debate.
Okay, whatever. I guess we'll come back.
I mean, if we can't think about it, then I mean, at a certain point, we're just gonna have to nix it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll do more CX episodes in the future, so whatever.
Yeah. This is just such a tilt, though. Anyway,
Why'd you have to bring it up? I would have been content in my ignorance.
dude, I just had a fucking revelation on the podcast, and then just didn't write it down. Fucking terrible human. And the last random tip for us to be good at cross examination is to just watch good debaters cross examine people. I mean, honestly, there is just no better way to improve your cross examination skills than to watch other people cross examine uh, cross examine people. I know that I watched a lot of our local debaters and I watched a lot of national debaters, and I sort of adopted some of their styles, at least initially.
Yeah, so my sophomore year, I went to nationals in Congress. So yeah, I already admitted that I went in public
Congress.
forum. So
Wow,
uh,
your life is over. I'm just gonna
I,
destroy you.
well, okay. So in fairness, I lost in the final round of our district tournament to someone who placed 11th that year at nationals. So it's not like I lost to a scrub. I just, you know, wasn't quite good enough. So
The
I
o-
went. I
the
went.
only the only winning move in the game of congressional debate is not to play. Just
Well,
kidding. I love Congress. Send emails to the argument clinic podcast at gmail.com if you like Congress. If you don't send me an email, then I'll assume you don't.
yeah, but in fairness, I had also qualified in foreign extent, but I didn't want to do that at all. So I went in Congress because you can sleep during the Congress sessions. Anyways, I actually went basically just to watch LD debates and during the out rounds. And the debater that I watched my sophomore year a lot, like 3 or 4 separate times, actually 5 including finals, was Gabe Bronstein, who ended up winning the national tournament that year. And I took away a lot of mannerisms from him because he actually debated a few of the Oklahoma debaters that I knew and beat them all pretty handedly. And it all started in cross examination when he would just assert himself in a much more confident manner than his opponents and demonstrate, a better knowledge of the way that, like, his opponent's value criterion worked, for instance, or the topic literature that was being referenced. And I can't even point to any specific question that he asked, but he was just so good at conveying an air of sort of confidence and composition that I believed just from watching this round that he'd already won the debate in cross examination. And I watched a lot of those rounds and I took a lot of those things back and I incorporated them into my own cross examination skills. And I also watched a lot of videos of this kid named Danny Dubois, which I'm sure most of you have heard of him because he won the 2014 TOC and NCFL national tournament. And he was also really good at cross examination. And so I just watched a lot of rounds of him and took away the things that he did during cross ex.
Yeah, I mean, winning the Argument Clinic podcast debate tournament, aka TOC, is certainly a huge achievement for any debater. Our sort of orcish alter egos host that tournament, and Danny Dubois was just, I guess, really persuasive to the orc people. So I guess that sort of increased his chances there. I guess we haven't given a shout out to the Argument Clinic podcast pretty much at all recently, but it's honestly a great podcast if you're an orc and also enjoy listening to some quality Lincoln Douglas debate content. But in all seriousness, Daniel Dubois, fantastic debater, obviously, won a lot of the tournaments, and he had a sort of very good poise to his cross examination skills. So watching him was truly a delight. Although I didn't get the opportunity to judge him many times because of mutual judge preferencing, so that that didn't happen. He did defeat one of my students, sophomore Danny Dubois defeated one of my students in a bid round one time, and that was kind of annoying, um, because at this point no one knew who it was. But then it turned out he was really good, and so that started to make sense. It was actually Terrence Sloanham that he bid in a bid round. I think it was like
Oh.
junior year Terrence Sloanham lost to like sophomore year Danny Dubois at like Minneapolis or something in a bid round. This is when Danny was like kind of, for all intents and purposes, still like a lay debater, but like was just like pretty good at making arguments, and so just
Yeah, sophomore year, Danny Duvall was very, very slow speaking. You can watch a lot of his rounds and not really have to know speed to follow along.
my favorite thing about Danny Dubois debating before his senior year when he was actually fast in his sophomore and junior years, you would be listening to him and you'd be like, oh, this kid's like pretty slow. He's like not speaking very fast. And then like after his speech was over, you would just look at your flow and be like, oh my god, how are there so many arguments? Like how? I thought I wasn't speaking very fast. And then you lose. Is normally how that would go.
Word efficiency is good, and Danny was very good at that.
That's true. Okay, so now some war stories. War stories, that term is kind of like a reference to the fact that when you know the type. People come from debate tournaments, or everyone wants to tell stories about their past debates, and they kind of embellish them. It's kind of like a sort of like a one of those like fisherman based stories. It's like, oh, the fish was this big. It's kind of like war stories, kind of like over exaggerated, but actually true. And it's a term that just refers to, past debates and the fun experiences that went along with those. So I have a good one to start us off here in the war stories category. So this was semifinals of the Florida State Championship, my senior year of high school, and I'm debating a kid who was a pretty good debater named Michael, who had beaten me 3 times in a row prior to that during the course of the regular season. He beat me a bunch, and I was set to debate him again in the semifinals. And it was a 3-judge panel for elimination rounds. I had one judge who was a pretty good policy judge and is now a very good LD coach, named Shatskin, and there was Dan Lewis, who was the head of Pinecrest debate team, which was a policy debate team. So these are some fairly technical judges. And the third judge, I think his name was Allen, but this guy was a Congress coach. So we basically decided going into this round, sort of, by ourselves, that we were just not gonna really debate for the Congress judge. We were gonna debate for the 2 judges that were more similar to each other and had sort of a policy level bit of experience. And I read an affirmative case that it was actually really cool. The argument was about private military firms, and the argument was, or that was the topic, and the argument was that we should send private military firms out to capture pirates because international law demands that we fight piracy, which was kind of sweet. And so the debate came down to whether or not I was allowed to defend sort of a narrow subset of the resolution. And what happened was cross-examination went as follows. So my opponent made an argument that I wasn't allowed to specify down to a narrower subset of the resolution because it was unpredictable, aka he couldn't have predicted that I would have read the specific advocacy that I did. And so in cross-examination went like this. I said to him, so is your argument is that this is not predictable. However, my advocacy was actually proposed on the Senate floor last week. So what is so why is it still unpredictable? Now, Michael has a number of responses to him here that aren't very embarrassing. A lot of responses that he can make are like, well, I shouldn't be responsible for every single bill that happens on the Senate floor, or like, well, specifying down an advocacy is still bad because of what it could justify in other areas, not just your area. So he has a number of ways that he can respond well, but he doesn't. Instead, his response is, I don't watch the news. And I was just like, what? You don't watch the news? And I was like, yeah, but surely you go on the internet, news sites. And he's like, no, I don't have internet. Or just some stupid excuse. And I was just like, wait, what? And I was like, how is it my problem that you don't check the news or have internet? And he was like, oh, I don't know. And then I realized that my goose was cooked if I didn't move on and ask other questions about various other things in the debate. So I went on to do that. And so fast forward to the end of the round. I win on a 2-1 decision. I lose Shatskin, one of the policy judges, and I win Dan Lewis, one of the other policy judges. And I won this guy Alan as well. And when the decision finally got to him, what Alan said for his decision was, "Look, I had no idea what was going on in this debate, but I do know that the affirmative made the negative look like a fool in cross-examination. Like, that was great." He said, "You made him totally look like he didn't know what he was talking about in cross-examination, and even though I didn't understand anything else that happened in the debate, I decided I could vote affirmative." So that was an example of a debate literally decided on cross-examination in an elimination round of the Florida State Championship. Anyway, Lawrence, are you awake yet?
Oh, I was supposed to be listening to that?
No, but you were supposed to fall asleep.
Oh, oh shoot. I'm sorry, I can't do anything right.
Okay. Well, do you have any stories of cross-examination that you would like to regale us with?
Oh, I do not have anything quite as interesting as someone straight up admitting that they don't read the news in cross-examination. Um, I think the only story that is somewhat interesting and memorable to me basically just demonstrates what type of debater that I was. So this was semifinals of the NSDA national tournament my senior year, and I was debating this person from Oklahoma. Actually, interestingly enough, that year at nationals, the octafinal round, I'd gotten the bye, so I didn't have to debate it. The quarterfinals, I debated this girl from Oklahoma. The semifinals, I debated that girl from Oklahoma again, and then in finals, I debated another person from Oklahoma. So from the top,
Clean
like,
sweep.
yeah, it was a good year for Oklahoma. It actually made nationals much less stressful because it was basically just redebating the state tournament again, because the person that I debated in quarters and semis was the person I debated in finals of state, and the person I debated in finals of nationals was the person I debated in semis of state. So it was just like the state tournament all over again. Anyway, so I was debating her, and I was affirmative. I just like read a general affirmative about the like why the government should care about national security over digital privacy. And cross-ex that happens probably doesn't really get too much. And this NC is being read, and this NC is a weird amalgamation of a bunch of different arguments that I didn't think really jived well together. So one of the contentions was the Constitution. It just said the Constitution guarantees the right to privacy, and they read some evidence to support that. They read some argument about how, like, I think surveillance programs were discriminatory. I think they read some arguments about how surveillance programs were ineffective and stuff like that. And the weird thing to me was they read a criterion of John Locke's social contract. So if you don't know much about me, as a debater when I was younger, my freshman year, the only book that I really ever read for debate was Two Treatises of Government by John Locke, because for some reason our school mid-high library had this book, and it was the only thing that I'd read. So by the end of my freshman year, I could recite like a good portion of John Locke's Two Treatises of Government back at you. And that was basically all I was good at in debates. And in fact, some of the cross-examinations that I had when I was younger were basically just, well, did you know that John Locke's social contract actually says, and that would be the debate, even when John Locke's social contract had not been brought up prior to that moment. And as soon as this person read this criterion of, like, John Locke's social contract, I was like, wait, I can win this debate. And everyone who knew me in the room just immediately sees my eyes light up as I just like pull up my computer and I'm like trying to find these freshman year John Locke pieces of evidence that I'd cut like freshman sophomore year. And I just remember cross-examination basically just harping off of the single piece of John Locke's social contract evidence that was being read by. Oh, actually, wait, no, the negative did not even read a piece of evidence from John Locke's social contract. They just asserted that it was a thing. So I just cross-examined them on the warrants of that for like maybe a minute and a half to 2 minutes until I just like absolutely proven to the judges this person does not know John Locke's social contract like me. I am a true believer in the Lockean social contract. And at the end of this debate, I think all of the judges vote for me, and I extend like a few pieces of evidence that I'd written from John Locke's social contract. And some of the ballots came back were basically just like cross-ex was enough to prove that the affirmative had a better understanding of the value criterion debate, vote affirmative or something like that. And that was just it wasn't like as nearly as interesting a story as yours, but I think it was a good example of how like just having that content knowledge and being confident in deploying that content knowledge really shines through even at the highest levels of competition. And it also demonstrates that I was a weird freshman debater.
It's not weird to read up on Locke's social contract. My main man, Big L.
It was also basically the only argument I read my sophomore year as well, up until the state tournament. I was just basically reading John Locke's social contract on both sides of a topic. I just pick different parts of his theory to be the contention level for each part. So like on sometimes it'd just be like the property stuff that Locke would talk about, and other times would be more about like the social contract as a whole. And I was basically only debating John Locke's social contract for like most of freshman and sophomore year.
Well, I have another story that's like fairly light, which is just whenever I would debate against my friend Brian Wilder, we were absolute besties. In high school, I had this friend Brian Wilder. Whenever we would go to local tournaments, we would all go undefeated until we debated each other. And if we didn't debate each other because our local tournaments didn't have elimination rounds, we would just get ranked, and whoever had the more speaker points would win. But I remember, we always had the most fun debates against each other. It was always just a huge amount of fun, especially because by a certain point in our careers, we had just written each other's prep, which meant that, like, I remember specifically in a round for the varsity state championship, which we would eventually qualify for, both. I remember that he read an affirmative case with a bunch of evidence that I had cut. And I would say, oh, are you aware that this evidence is slightly out of context or whatever from this article? And then he would be like, oh, fancy that. And then I read some turns that he had cut, and he would be like, oh, are you aware that these turns are slightly out of context? And I'd be like, oh, fancy that. It was a delight. We were both just cheesing throughout the entirety of CrossX. It was glorious. So CrossX can be a fun time for you and for me, kiddos. And by you, I mean Lawrence. And by me, I mean also Lawrence. So that's it for War Stories. Let's move on to our conclusion segment. Well, that's our episode for this week. Thank you for coming and being such active listeners. Every single pregnant pause from your listening to our wise words of wisdom definitely helped us to just keep the show going. Thank you. You all are a tremendous help, and if you'd like to compliment yourselves, please send an email to the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com. Also send an email to the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com if you like anything that we said during the episode, if you hated anything that we said during the episode, if you do disagree with the results of the mini debate, if you think that Lawrence should be more aggressive in cross-examination so that he can win nationals a fourth time, you should also send us an email. Also, feel free to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, check out our Reddit account or whatever, and feel free to hit up the Victory Briefs Institute for camp this summer. Feel free to hit up the Victory Briefs website. All right, now with all of that out of the way, and if you send us an email at the Argument Clinic Podcast at gmail.com, there's a pretty real chance that we'll give you a shout out. Except the important Lawrence, if you're listening, no more shout outs for you, Buster. You've lost your rights. Okay. Mini debate. So, what mini debate topic should I select for this week? How about this, Lawrence? Who is the best philosopher?
Oh, well, so I think you already know my answer.
Like as a person.
Oh.
And you can just make up stuff about their personhood based on their philosophy if you want. But I have a supremely good answer that I'm just gonna shower you with. Okay. So I think that the best philosopher person was John Dewey, not close.
Okay.
So John Dewey, in addition to being like an awesome philosopher of things like education and experience, is one of the American philosophers, one of the great pragmatists. He also like founded this like Chicago experimental public school system. He like advocated for change. When I was, and this is 100% serious, when I was in college for the final project for one of my classes, I created a set of Magic the Gathering cards around American Pragmatists, which was the philosophy class, and I acquired, for the purpose of this class, a picture of John Dewey chopping wood in Nova Scotia at age 90. John Dewey is just like such a G. He's just like awesome. He's like so good. Anyway, so that's my answer. I can accept your surrender now, but before I do that, I want to hear your answer.
Well, you said you would accept my surrender now. Can I not just surrender now?
I changed my mind.
Oh. All right. So I'm just gonna go with Jeremy Bentham. For no other reason than the fact that he had his body dissected after death and permanently displayed, and then with instructions for his followers to bring out his body every single year in sort of a demonstration or praise of Jeremy Bentham as a person. And if that doesn't say something about the philosopher, I don't know what does. And, maybe he was a terrible person during life. I don't think he was. I think he was actually a pretty strong, social progressive. Like he did things like tackle police corruption, if I remember correctly.
When you say he was strong, does that mean like chopping wood in Nova Scotia at age 90 strong, or just like,
I don't think he lived to that time. I think he died when he was he died when he was 84. So he was not 90 chopping down wood, but he had his body preserved, which is all I rest my case on.
All right, so can I just now I'll accept your surrender.
You have it. You can formally accept my surrender.
Okay, John Dewey is the absolute man, just like a total G, and he's really good. And like being in Nova Scotia would be, that's the episode for this week, and we encourage all of our listeners to stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.